So just as a little bit of a background about what I'm going to talk about today, this goes back to my first research project, which was on a collection of Holocaust photography about the world, which I'll talk, of course, much more from the Lodz ghetto. And I should also say, as a word of disclaimer, I'm not a scholar of visual culture. I'm not a scholar of photography. I'm a historian who's using photography. And there'll certainly be people in this room who know much more about visual culture and specifically. And I'll be looking forward to your responses at the end. I should also say, the book which published some of these photos was published quite some time ago in 2004, and what I'll talk about a little bit is what I've been trying to do a little bit since then, and a few things I've been trying to make sense of. One thing was, and which maybe I didn't get too far, is to make sense of photographs like this. This is, of course, a very powerful image taken in 1943. Of a boy dressed up as a ghetto policeman. It was taken 1 full year after the deportation of the children of the ghetto. Who is the boy? How was it possible that a year after the deportation of the children of the ghetto, they were still in the ghetto? Why is he not identified? Why is he edited out of the story? It is these kinds of questions that I'll try to identify today, really for two reasons. Both to try to make sense of what was happening in the ghetto and in ghetto society and how ghetto society worked, but also as an attempt to see how Holocaust history has been written, how history and memory has interacted in the writing of Holocaust history, what role survivors, what role curators, what role historians have played in this evolving image of the Shoah. I will not be able to give the name of the boy. It's an ongoing puzzle. Or jigsaw, piece of jigsaw puzzle. However, by trying to figure out who he is and by trying to answer how it was possible that children like this boy continued to be in the ghetto in 1943 and why we have not heard more about children like him, we can address a host of other questions. What is the relationship between textual and visual evidence in the writing of Holocaust history, for instance? What has been the self-representation of Holocaust survivors and what role have they played in the writing of Holocaust history? What is the role of photography in textual interpretations of the Holocaust? What was the relationship between Germans and Jews at Lodz? What were the dynamics of ghetto society? What social networks existed in the ghetto? And so on. Who has actually taken this photograph and how has it come to me? Well, it was taken by Henrik Ross, the photographer of the image of the boy we saw a second ago. He was one of the official Jewish photographers in the ghetto who also secretly recorded its suffering. Before the liquidation of the ghetto in 1944, he buried the photos in a box in the ground of the ghetto. That they were not lost, we have to thank Henrik Ross for, who survived the Holocaust and who retrieved his treasure in 1945. After the war, he made some of his photos available. They've been used in the Eichmann trial and in the Holocaust museums of the world to shape our visual image of what went on within the barbed wire enclosed ghetto, with their scenes of hunger, despair, executions, deportations, and death. However, as we now know, we never saw the great majority of Ross's pictures during his lifetime. Ross died in 1991 here in Israel. In the second half of the 1990s, his son sold the photos to the Archive of Modern Conflict in London, a small private photo archive. I was lucky enough at the time to be asked to assess the collection for the archive. There I then sat one day in a small cramped room in central London and had an old, huge, bulky suitcase in front of me. I opened the suitcase, finding envelopes and bags full of photos, negatives, ghetto newspapers and some of Ross's personal items. Anyway, at the time when I was working on these photographs, I was naturally quite excited, but I expected to find more of the same kind of photos from the Holocaust that we all know so well. This would have been an amazing find in itself, but this is not what I found. What I soon realized was that he did not just capture scenes of torture, of dying children, of executions, or of faces full of despair. There were also depictions of family life and of seemingly normal scenes of life in the streets, and I'll show you some of those photos in a minute. So at the time, I started to ask myself what to make of these photographs. More problematically, there were also images of the private life of the ghetto elite. The Jewish council, the German-appointed Jewish administration in charge of the day-to-day running of the ghetto, and people around them, as well as of the Jewish ghetto police, and indeed of children who were temporarily saved through their parents' willingness to cooperate with the Germans. So what I'm telling you about today is about my first attempts to make sense of these photographs. As I said, there was a small book in 2004, and there were also a few small exhibitions in France, in Prague, and in Madrid, and so on. And as a result of that, I have been able to gather some more information. Okay, so let me show you the photos I have already been talking about, and then we'll continue where we stopped. So here we see the photograph of Henrik Ross excavating his collection in early of 1945 from the grounds of the ghetto in Lodz, where he had hidden his collections before the liquidation of the ghetto. Then I was talking about the kind of typical photographs that he did make available during his lifetime that have been used time and time again in exhibitions and in Holocaust museums. This is quite a well-known photograph. These are photographs from the Gesperre of 1942, then the photographs of executions that he took at great risk of his own life. It's also a photograph that has been of deportation that has often been reproduced. And now I'll show you a number of these more kind of private photographs. This is from a party for this boy who was also dressed up as a ghetto as a ghetto policeman from 1943. So let's jump the section on the history of the ghetto, and I mean, suffice to say that this was the second biggest ghetto of the Holocaust after Warsaw. We know relatively little about Henrik Ross's life. Born in May of 1910 in Warsaw, he worked in Łódź for a Warsaw newspaper before the war, accredited as a sports photographer. In January of 1940, he was forced to move to the part of the city that was designated as the ghetto, and soon found himself confined there. He became one of two official Jewish ghetto photographers at Lodz, employed from late 1940 by the Jewish administration's Department of Statistics. Along with his colleague Mendel Grossman, Ross's job was to take official propaganda pictures and to produce the thousands of identification photographs of ghetto inhabitants required by the Germans. Both Ross's and Grossman's work gave them permanent access to cameras, film and darkroom equipment, which they used to document the horrors of their ghetto, risking their lives in the process, as for instance in this image of deportations taken at the railway station, which he took from a position of hiding. Ross recalled in an interview, I think from the 1980s, the conditions for taking photographs were extremely difficult. The photographic materials were smuggled to me in exchange for bread, of which I had far too little. Recounting the circumstances behind a photograph of deportation that Ross took at the ghetto railway station in 1944, which we see here, Ross explained how railway workers smuggled him into the station, saying, "I was locked in a store from where I was able, through a hole in the wood, to photograph the deportation. After being locked in for 14 hours, the workers who conspired with me let me out. It was extremely dangerous for me." When the remaining residents of the ghetto were deported to Auschwitz in August of 1944, Ross was one of about 800 men and women who stayed behind as members of the cleanup commando. And then in January of 1945, the Red Army liberated Lodz, and ultimately Ross emigrated to Israel and took his photographs after he had dug them up, as we have seen, with him. Grossman, the other photographer, unlike Ross, did not survive the Holocaust, but his photographs were rescued after liberation and were taken to Palestine, where the vast majority disappeared during the War of Independence. The surviving pictures of both photographers soon became keystones in the visual representation of German inflictors' horrors of ghetto life by Holocaust museums and book on the Shoah. They were also used as evidence in the trial of the main administrator of the Holocaust, of course, Adolf Eichmann, in Jerusalem in 1961. And here we see Ross in the witness box in Jerusalem. In the catalogue of his photos, which he compiled in 1987, 4 years before his death, he expressed what had driven him in the ghetto. He said, "I wanted to leave a record of our martyrdom," thus, of course, stressing the mortal dangers to which he had exposed himself in taking the photographs. This account of Ross's life is the story of a man who met the challenge of German terror with bravery. War and genocide transformed him into a hero, and his life represented the moral victory of the forces of good against evil. But is this the full story? Does the unpublished part of his collection support such a reading? And why did he not make more of his pictures public during his lifetimes, or why were they not made public by other people, as we'll see later? One straightforward explanation for Ross's decision not to release many of his photographs could be that he simply considered them private. For instance, here we see 2 photographs of his wife Stefania, being domestic scenes, many featuring his wife, recorded for personal reasons or for the albums of the people depicted. It would hardly be surprising if he considered these historically less interesting or important than photos of executions and deportations. Furthermore, there's the question of how public taste and historical interest has shifted over time. Photographs of quieter, less dramatic moments may now be considered more powerful than was the case after the war. We have become, of the last 60 or 70 years, we have become familiar with scenes of Holocaust atrocities, as well as with violent news imagery in general, while arguably more receptive to intimate domestic pictures. But these explanations do not wholly account for why Ross did not make more of his photographs available. Comparing those he released with those he withheld, it seems clear that his post-war decisions were specifically intended to serve a particular interpretation of ghetto history. Indeed, the published photographic record of the ghetto generally should be treated with the same degree of caution that one should apply to any historical account based on memory, including Holocaust survivors' written and oral accounts. True, authentic images of the ghetto provide contemporary documentary evidence free from the later mediating influence of memory, trauma, and post-Holocaust identity. Yet, once survivors become involved in the process of choosing which pictures to include or exclude, inevitably they will be offering a version of life in the ghetto based on post-war experiences. Hence, they cease to be either unmediated accounts of experiences or pure snapshots of history. The issue here is, of course, not whether this is right or wrong. It is simply to underline the problems that arise when one treats photographs as unbiased documents that supposedly speak for themselves. The examples of the selective use of Lodge photographs to present a particular interpretation of ghetto life are the two photographic books of Ross and Grossman's work, which is Ross's The Last Journey of the Jews of Lodz, published in an undated edition in Israel during the 1960s, and the second one, With a Camera in the Ghetto, Grossman's posthumously edited photograph published in Tel Aviv by the Ghetto Fighters House in 1970. Ross himself chose the photographs for the first book, while Alexander Klugman, another survivor of the ghetto, was the book's editor. And many of the photographs that I had shown you at the beginning of the kind of almost iconographic images of the Holocaust were published in these books. While the other book was not edited by survivors of the ghetto, the selection of photos was clearly influenced by survivors. The editors indeed acknowledge the help of Grossman's sister and of another two survivors, Nachman Sonnabend and Arieh ben Menachem, in bringing the book together. The photos in both books depict scenes of hunger, despair, and death. Typical examples would be the picture of an emaciated boy lying in the street that we saw earlier, or the image of the distressed woman on a cart during a deportation that we also saw earlier. There is no doubt that these are true testimonies of the horrors of the ghetto, yet they are not presented as document in their own right in these books. Rather, they are used as powerful illustrations of a particular understanding of ghetto life as shaped by the emerging collective memory of survivors. Ross even modified at least one photo in his book so that it would support this view more effectively. So one can see this by comparing the image reproduced without retouching on the right-hand side from a damaged negative with the repaired image that appeared in Ross's book, which we see on the left-hand side. The photograph depicts the Aryan street running through the ghetto, and it is clear that Ross added liberal quantities of barbed wire on either side of the street here, thus dramatizing his source material to support his memory of the ghetto. Another photograph that shows how these photographs were used to support a particular interpretation of the ghetto that had evolved is a photograph that was included in this book of a heap of decapitated corpses, which appears in Ross's book with the caption, "The corpses supplied the fat became soap." And opposite it, he placed a photograph of a bar of soap bearing the letters RIF, explaining this as, quote, "RAF, soap made out of Jewish fat." By doing this, Ross was contributing to a story that had at some point entered the collective memory of a section of the Holocaust survivor community, but research has shown that it is almost certainly a myth. RAF did not stand for rheinisch-jüdisches Fett or pure Jewish fat, as popularly believed, but for Reichsstelle für industrielle Fettversorgung, Reich Agency for the Supply of Fats. Soap bearing these initials had been in circulation before the Holocaust started, and chemical examinations of RAF soap have uncovered no traces of human fat. That being so, Ross could not have witnessed what he suggests. And as I also found out in an interview after the book came out with Klugman, what how this photograph got into the book was that he actually had, just after the war, seen these photographs and heard these stories, and he thought that it would be worthwhile including in his book. So he took photos of these photos that he saw wherever and included them in his book without giving any indication that they were taken neither by him nor that they were taken at a place other than Lodz. Thus, we need to treat his book less as a collection of documentary evidence and more as an expression of mediated experience. There are also some apparent contradictions between Ross's statements about how he gathered photographs and evidence within the pictures themselves. He repeatedly stressed the danger involved in taking the photographs of deportees being loaded onto trains destined for the death camps, telling us that he was able to do this only by being smuggled by railway workers out of the ghetto to the train station, as we've seen a minute ago. So yet if this was true, that he had only been able to get to the station by being smuggled out, how could he have taken photographs, as we see here, of deportations underway, outside the ghetto perimeter and under the eyes of the ghetto police? Without doubt, Ross would have been shot had he been caught recording the German guards at work, herding Jews onto train carriages. So there is no doubt that he's absolutely right that the photograph that we saw earlier was taken at the risk of his own life. But was he exaggerating the danger posed by the Jewish police as opposed to by the German soldiers? Perhaps in an attempt to portray himself as part of the underground, or to distance himself from their milieu and in turn from their relationship to the Jewish council. Ross is of course by no means alone in his selective and sometimes rhetorical use of Holocaust images. This can be seen in the iconography surrounding Rumkowski, the leader of the Jewish Council of Lodz. And there's more about this in the book. And likewise, the condemnation of ghetto policemen accused after the war of willingly becoming the German henchmen has been translated into an iconography that supports this reading. It is no surprise. It's no surprise. Sorry, this is actually this I should have shown you when I said that he took these photographs of these deportations while the policemen were actually quite clearly watching him and being well aware that he was there. So it is no surprise that it is the photo of ghetto policemen that we see here arresting Jews trying to escape from the hospital during the mass deportations of the G-Sperre in September of 1942 that has become one of the best known representations of their work. The underlying message conveyed by these traditional representations is that Jews in the ghetto were at the mercy not only of the barbarism of the Germans, but also of the ghetto administration itself. In recent years, however, an increasing number of historians and observers an increasing number of historians and observers have been more favorable in their portrayal of Rumkowski, pointing out that his collaboration with the Germans was a potentially viable survival strategy. Realizing that the only value the Jews had for the Germans was in terms of their labor, he concluded that the best chance of survival for as many Jews as possible was employ a rescue-to-work strategy. Thus, he turned the ghetto into a thriving workshop, specializing in the production of clothing and military uniforms. And for a while, it seemed effective. The Lodz ghetto both survived longer than any other ghetto in Poland and had the highest survival rate. It should also be stressed that Jewish leaders had no way of knowing what the future would bring. More significantly, many of Ross's depictions defy the canonical representation of ghetto policemen, depicting them as friendly community figures who cared for others as lovers, husbands, or fathers, or who would carry the suitcases for the deportees on the way to the station. The existence of these photographs, but the choice that they would not either be available to the public, or would at least not would not be available made to Holocaust institutions, or where they were made available, that they were chosen not to be published, supports the view that the negative visual representation of Romkowski and the Jewish police has been the result of a tendency to find and publish photographs, so to teleologically look for sources that suited that particular reading, that it reflected a particular point of view about ghetto life. There may be other reasons contributing to Ross only making available those photos that supported the conventional reading of ghetto life. It may stem from increasing marginalization from the section of the survivor community that was most closely involved with the institutions dedicated to Holocaust remembrance. Generations of writers and publishers on the Lodz ghetto have largely indeed ignored him. Institutions such as YIVO and the Institute for Jewish Research in New York City, which held many Lodz ghetto photographs, had little contact with him. What seems to have occurred is a falling out within the survivor community. To understand what happened, it is necessary to go back to the immediate post-war period and look at the interaction of those who were to become some of the key players in the visual remembrance of the ghetto. After the war, the Lodz survivor Alexander Klugman, whom I mentioned earlier, accused another survivor, Nachman Sonnabend, of having been a Gestapo agent. Sonnabend recalled the incident in 1991, and bear with me for 1 minute because it's an important piece of evidence. So he recalled in 1991, in the summer of 1948, the Warsaw paper Das Neue Leben published an article by a certain Alexander Klugman, an aspiring party hack from Lodz, keen to make a quick career. The article, entitled How a Gestapo Man, Nachman Sonnabend, Became a Martyr in the New York Yad van YIVO, presented me as a Gestapo agent stained with the blood of Jewish victims. Unquote. Sonnabend, whom I've just quoted, had been Lodz postman, subsequently employed by the Department of Construction at the Ghetto railway station and at the meatpacking center. He later stated, also in this 1991 pamphlet from which I've just quoted, that he was friends with Grossman and Ross in the ghetto, so was both photographers. Like Ross, Sonnabend survived the ghetto and after liberation retrieved documents and photographs hidden there, donating them to institutions in Israel and to YIVO in New York, where they are held in a collection bearing his name. In 1955, Sonnabend sent at least 2 letters from Sweden, where he then lived, to Ross in Israel, attempting to persuade him to collaborate on a book of photos, along with Mendel Grossman's, to commemorate the 10th anniversary of the liberation of the ghetto. As drafts of the design for the book indicate, which we see here, Ross started indeed work on the project, but the book was never published. It would seem that Ross and Sonnabend had some kind of disagreement, since Ross chose instead to bring out his own book with Sonnabend's nemesis, Alexander Klugman, as its editor. So he chose to go with a person who had accused Sonnabend to have been a Gestapo agent as the editor of his book. A few years after Ross's book appeared, Mendel Grossman's With a Camera in the Ghetto was published. So the book of the other photographer, with the help of Sonnabend, in this case. Curiously, it contained a number of photos that had already appeared in Ross's book. Since that time, many publications and archives have attributed photos to Grossman for which negatives exist in the Ross collection, suggesting that they were really Ross's photos. At least 7 of the photos published in this particular book, for example, have been attributed to Grossman elsewhere. The 7 photos from Ross's own book have been attributed to Grossman elsewhere. Even the catalogue of Unser Weg ist Arbeit, Our Way is Work, the large photographic exhibition on the history of Lodz held in 1990 at the Jewish Museum of Frankfurt, while Ross was still alive, did not dignify his post-war history beyond a buried reference in a caption to a photo on page 178. It said, Henrik Ross survived the liquidation of the ghetto in hiding and now lives in Tel Aviv. This omission is all the more surprising given that the catalogue published for the general book market included many articles about the ghetto and its photographic history, as well as pieces written by survivors. Ross's newly discovered photos raised the question of whether Ross might have been more involved with the ghetto elite than he was willing to admit. His pictures of ghetto dignitaries often depict their private and domestic lives rather than showing them at official occasions. They have the intimate character of family photographs. How could Ross have gained access to their gardens and houses if he was not privy to this life himself, particularly since these photos even seem, which is basically the social circle of ghetto policemen, were taken almost certainly outside the parameters of the ghetto, and this was of course a very hermetically sealed ghetto. The dignitary policemen and their families depicted do not seem to be responding to a stranger, or even to an official photographer, but appear to be at ease in his presence. This suggests the possibility that Ross had been shunned by part of the survivor community because they knew or assumed that he had intermingled with the privileged of the ghetto, that he had been able to live a relatively easy life whilst others around him were dying. Tempting though this explanation might be, it is ultimately unsatisfactory, since it follows the tendency among survivors, historians, and other observers to discuss collaboration and resistance as a problem only faced by the Jewish Council's ghetto policemen and the very small group of people around them. According to this view, ghetto life beyond the council and its policemen was characterized by human solidarity. As the historian Yehuda Bauer once remarked, the poor helped those that were poorer. Reality in the ghetto was less lofty. In the face of violence, human bonds disintegrated as often as they were strengthened. Yet, this aspect of the ghetto experience has often been edited out of the story. Even beyond the question of the degree to which Ross intermingled with the ghetto elite, in both his case and in Grossman's, resistance and collaboration were not mutually exclusive concepts. No doubt, both photographers exposed themselves to mortal dangers when taking documentary pictures of executions or deportations. This work was certainly an act of resistance. Had they been caught, these acts of bravery would have meant their instant death. In an article on Grossman, Rien Ben Menachem has stressed that the Department of Statistics of the Jewish Council, for whom both Grossman and Ross worked, collected, quote, all the true information concerning the ghetto, unquote, thus allocating it a heroic role. At the same time, however, it was the very institution that drew up the list of deportees. And since they agreed to be employed by us, Ross and Grossman could be called collaborators. The Germans were dependent on the department's work in order to carry out the Holocaust, and rejection of its terms of employment would have meant they, rather than others, ended up on the deportation lists. In September of 1942, during the G-Sperre, the German authorities decreed that all children, as well as the sick and elderly in the ghetto, were to be deported, since they had no labor value. However, it was not only the German SD or Sicherheitsdienst, as Ross incorrectly claimed when he gave his graphic testimony in the witness box in the Eichmann trial, who rounded up the children for deportation. The German authorities maliciously delegated a major part of the job to Rumkowski, allowing him a certain number of exemptions. He used his power to exclude the children of policemen, firefighters, and anyone who would volunteer to participate in the rounding up of the ghetto's children. Contrary to Orthodox view, Therefore, all inmates who wished to save their offspring from deportation had to face the same kinds of dilemma as those confronting the council and the police force. What happened actually to these children? In memoirs and historical accounts about Lodge, there is generally silence about their fate. But Ross's photographs show them. And particularly, I mean, remember the photograph that I showed earlier of that party, of this children's party from 1943, taking a year after the deportation of the children of the ghetto. You can also see how these photos of children have been used. If we look at this particular image, which is from Ross's book from the 1960s, with the caption, "As the children at the most tragic of victims." However, what his caption and his book suggest here is incorrect for these particular of these particular children, as we know from both the negative the picture is taken from and from the catalogue Ross did himself of his photos in 1987. Because the first image, which was taken just before they put in the spoons into their mouth, look extremely dark photo, while the photograph that were just taken a little bit earlier, there the girl almost seems to be smiling. And indeed, the caption Ross gave the photos in 1987 for his catalogues was "Temporary Asylum for Children of Ghetto Dignitaries," and the negative also makes it blatantly clear that the photos were taken during the Gehsperre. Obviously, the point is here not to say these were not victims. I mean, obviously, almost all these children ultimately died in the Holocaust anyway. But the point is that they did not depict in the initial book what Ross claimed that they depicted, but that they were the children who were temporarily saved. And likewise, the family of the boy appears 65 times in among Ross's photos, but while elsewhere he tends to identify people, he strangely does not identify them, and if at all, he says just either ghetto residents or people who had more, so like distancing himself from them. But the sheer number of photographs and also the way he took photographs of, for instance, the mother of that boy shows that he was intimately familiar with them. Which raises, of course, the question what Ross's relationship with his family was. For ghetto inhabitants to have survived until 1944, as Ross did, and thus to have maintained even a slim chance of survival, tended to require more than just good luck. The Germans had delegated the power to distribute food rations to the Jewish Council, and all those who were fit and willing to work received higher rations. This meant that the ability and, equally importantly, the willingness to work, as well as compliance with Romkowski's orders, ensured better food rations at a time when death rates from starvation or from tuberculosis, often triggered by malnutrition, were staggering. But specific choices enabling survival often went further than that. The German authorities gave Romkowski and his council the choice either to draw up lists for deportation to the extermination camp at Revno, or to face a liquidation of the entire ghetto. So, faced with the impossible choice, the council first entered the names of all those who had ever spoken up against it, as well as criminals, along with their entire family. Often, the only crime that many of these had committed was to steal potato peelings in order to save their families from starvation. When the Germans demanded yet more Jews for deportation, the Jewish administration earmarked for death everybody unfit or unwilling to work, and thus unable to contribute to and collaborate with the German war effort. In other words, it was not only the policemen who had to face a dilemma of whether or not to increase their family's chances of survival by effectively doing the Germans' work. Ordinary ghetto inmates were given the choice of whether to collaborate with the Germans by working in the ghetto's factories or to reap food rations that were so low that made survival well nigh impossible, or to face deportation for that matter. Ultimately, the vast majority of ghetto inhabitants, at least 95%, irrespective of their position in the ghetto and of the decisions that they had taken there, perished in the Holocaust. A third of the prisoners died of starvation or disease within the ghetto. After liquidations recommenced in 1944, with the Red Army advancing, almost the entire ghetto population, including Rimkowski himself, died in Auschwitz or in death marches. As he later stated, Ross himself had become so emaciated that by the time of liberation, he weighed a mere 38 kilograms. You see a photograph with Russian soldiers just after the liberation, 1945. The picture that emerges is that generally only those inhabitants who chose to accept certain positions within the ghetto and to comply with Rimkowski's counsel and thus with the Germans maintained any chance of survival. Ghetto residents were therefore, to a small degree at least, not just the objects of the council and the Germans, but, within narrow confines, also subjects of their own life and death decisions. Yet if Jews actively took these decisions, can we still maintain that collaboration was only a phenomenon affecting a tiny minority of people around Rimkowski? The conventional understanding of collaboration is that it results from a positive decision driven by personal and or ideological gain, while cooperation or involuntary collaboration is forced upon victims without bringing them personal benefit. This distinguishes the behavior of a Vichy collaborator or the Kislings in Norway and the Jews on the other hand. However, the Jewish administrators of Lodz do not fit neatly into this model. A problem that, of course, Primo Levi famously addressed in his essay The Grey Zone. He argued that the moral behavior of people like Rimkowski was not black or white, good or bad, but grey and ambiguous. Still, Levy's argument depends on the idea that good and bad behavior in the ghetto was possible. With the moral conduct of some Jewish counselors, policemen, or capos falling somewhere in the middle. So in other words, even though I might say, well, maybe most people were somewhere in the gray zone, it's still assumed that you could be just white or black. Yet, as we have seen, human behavior in the Holocaust generally involved collaboration and resistance at the same time. Jews who clearly did not agree with Nazi ideology often decided to cooperate with the Nazis and thus to contribute to the machinery of the Holocaust in the hope that they would receive the most precious personal gain imaginable: survival, if only temporarily, and also survival for one's family and friends. Even though the impossible dilemmas that the Nazis imposed on ghetto inmates made them collaborators of a kind, for the vast majority of survivors, this was a long way away from the immoral collaboration of profiteers. For some, maybe for most, collaboration went hand in hand with resistance. The two intimately and necessarily related. Often, collaboration was a prerequisite to launch effective resistance. Rather than following the trend to categorize almost any Jewish behavior during the Holocaust as either resistance or collaboration, a more nuanced decision is required, I would argue, distinguishing between the conscious and the unconscious, voluntary and involuntary, informed and uninformed, ideological and opportunistic, collusive and combative. As the Chicago historian Bernard Wasserstein has argued, collaboration is best understood as a palimpsest in which old loyalties are erased, new ones are written, those are rubbed out, and yet others are written, all to reflect a rapidly changing external environment. Modern war, Wasserstein says, tries to reduce all loyalties to one, but in real life there are many, and war does not get rid of them. Loyalties to family, nation, class, ideology, army unit, generation, institutions, community, they all continued, indeed are often accentuated under pressure of war. The reality that war often brings to the fore is that these are frequently cross-cutting and sometimes competing loyalties, unquote. Thus, the picture of the Lodz ghetto that evolved from a critical exploration of the Ross collection differs significantly from that offered by the traditional iconography and by an uncritical use of accounts of the Shoah. To conclude, to date it had been formed by a rather selective use of Holocaust photography and of oral and textual evidence of survivors. Survivors such as Henrik Ross had made photos available to the public that were wholly in keeping with the interpretation that Jews in the ghetto were at the mercy not only of the barbarism of the Germans, but also of the Jewish ghetto administration itself. As a result, the traditional iconography depicted the members of the Jewish council and of the Jewish police in the most unfavorable way imaginable, while depicting all other ghetto residents as passive victims. Now, with a complete set of photos, we can compare them with the photos that had been used before in publications and exhibitions and see how our image of the Holocaust has been dominated by these early collected memory of survivors. What emerges from the complete set of Ross's photographs, unlike from previous oral and textual testimonies, and Ross's own previously disseminated pictures, supports the view that all ghetto residents had to face the same kinds of dilemmas and that the contrast between the Jewish council and ordinary Jews in the ghetto was not one of black and white. However, it is not my intention to criticize the decision made by survivors in the ghetto in order to save their families. Nor is it to overlook the concerns of survivors that, as time passes, they will lose control over the memory of the Holocaust, or see Holocaust photos scrutinized in ways that detract from their function as sites of mourning. Nor does this account provide succor to Holocaust deniers who threaten to re-up every time historians point out to the dissonance between historical evidence and survivors' memories, ready to spin and misconstrue the evidence. On the contrary, the unfamiliar picture of life in the ghetto that Ross's previously unreleased photographs present only adds to our understanding of the diabolical crimes of Nazi Germany. The decisions that Henrik Ross made during the Holocaust, as a Jew, as a husband, and as a photographer, are marked by the navigation of competing loyalties and an almost inevitable combination of heroism and compromise, collaboration and resistance. This does not make him exceptional. The scrutiny he's placed under here today may be precisely what he sought to avoid during his lifetime by the selective release of his photographs. But he did not seek to avoid scrutiny indefinitely. He kept and preserved his archive, and before he died, prepared and catalogued it for future generations to make sense of it. This decision may seem minor by comparison with his actions during the war, but it is brave all the same. What is exceptional is the archive that he leaves us. It deserves proper appreciation and attention by those of us seeking deeper knowledge and understanding of the Holocaust and by students of photographic evidence, exploring the moments where art and history collide. Nevertheless, I was of course worried when the photos first came out in this book about the reception of my work, but my worries have, with very, very few exceptions, been unfounded. And for instance, in 2005, we had a meeting, we organized a meeting, the National Portrait Gallery in London, with survivors. Where, for instance, met Helen Aronson, who turned out to have been this woman in the picture. So during the discussion that we then had, and with the survivors and the editor and me at this point, Helen Aronson, who had proposed to me, so that's her name, as she arrived that she had butterflies in her stomach and had so far quietly followed the discussion, and stood up. She said, "You have talked a lot about the so-called privileged," she said, addressing the other survivors. "I suppose I was one." In her mild-mannered voice, she tells her story. Her very special father, she said, had in 1940 led the children of her hometown to the Lodz ghetto in the hope that he would save them. He knew Rumkowski and knew that he would look after them. Helen Arendt's brother soon worked in the ghetto as a liaison with the Germans, her mother in a shop that distributed food. She herself, being almost still a child herself, looked after the children in the ghetto orphanage. That was the privilege, she said. We got food, that is why I survived. When the ghetto inhabitants began to be shipped off to Auschwitz in 1944, she continued, "I had the privilege to stay behind with the clearing up commando, to work for the German commander of the ghetto, to vacate offices in the clear up of the ghetto." At the time, she befriended the secretary of the German commander, a German woman. Her German friend secretly gave her extra food and even brought her a revolver and ammunition. Still, at one point, Helen Aronson had still been seconds away from deportation to an extermination camp. Only sheer luck, rather than any favoritism, had saved her. The children in the orphanage she had cared for so lovingly were all gassed at Revno. And as I said earlier, even Rumkowski himself died at Auschwitz. It's really been interviews with people like Helen Aronson, who we see her at her 80th birthday party, and a few other pieces of research I've done since then that allow us to try to make more sense of these photographs, to identify them, and also to figure out more why, for instance, these photographs were not made available earlier. And in a way, the picture is becoming almost more complicated than that it's becoming easier. I mean, for instance, I found out since the publication of the book that Ross had actually indeed made available almost all his photos to Lochamei Hageteot and to the Museum of the Jewish Diaspora. But when I first researched the book, when I contacted Lochamei Hageteot, they just said that they didn't have anything on Ross, and it's only been 2 or 3 years ago that they said, oh, actually we do have something, and then it turned out that they had almost everything, or that the Museum of the Jewish Diaspora, that the photo archivist there is extremely nice. That when I went to see her 2 years ago, that she honestly thought that they didn't have any of his collections, and then I showed her a letter from her institution written in the 1980s to Ross, acknowledging that he had sent photos, and she said, how odd. And then she sent one of her assistants to the back, and at some point they found them, but there were no traces in their catalog of them. So, as I said, the story continues in a way is getting more complicated by the day. Thank you.